All right, the first component we're going to build is expense list because it's the easiest, so we can get it out of the way and build some momentum. That's just my personal preference. Some people prefer to do the hard tasks first, but I prefer to start with something simple and easy just to get into the right mindset. Now, up to this point, we have added all of our components inside the components folder. But now that we're working on a mini project, it's better to create a new folder under the source folder called Expense Tracker. So this folder is going to contain all the building blocks for our expense tracker app. This is a good way to structure a large, complex application. So if you want to build an application like Amazon, we don't want to throw all our components inside the components folder. Instead, we should divide our application into different functional areas or modules, the same way a supermarket is divided into different sections. So here under the expense tracker folder, we add a new folder called components. And here we add a new file called expenselist.tsx. Now let's create a function component. Now in this component, we want to return a table with two classes. Table, this is essential for all tables in Bootstrap. And optionally, we want to give this a second class, table-bordered, to give it nice borders. Let's press tab. Okay. Now here we need to add a t-head. Inside this t-head, we need a tr with 4 th elements. So th times 4. Tab, boom. Now let's specify our headings. So description, amount, category, and we leave out the last one because this is where we'll have the delete button. Now after the t-head section, we need a t-body. Now here we need to render our expenses, but we don't want to store the expenses in this component. We want to pass them as props. So this will be a reusable component. So just like always, first we use an interface to define the shape of props. Here we need a property called expenses, but the type of this is not going to be something like a string array or a number array because each expense is going to be an object. So first we need to use an interface to define the shape of each expense. Now each expense object needs a few properties like ID, which is a number, description, which is a string, amount, which is also a number, and category, which is a string. Now in a real-world application, category is going to be an object with two properties, ID and name. But let's not worry about those complexities at this point. We just want to focus on the core concepts you need to master before you move on to advanced topics. So this is the definition of an expense object. Now that we have this interface, we say the expenses property is an array of expense objects. Next, let's add the props here. Okay. Now, here in the t-body section, we grab our expenses and map them to tr elements. So each tr needs to have a key. And for that, we're going to use expense.id. Now, inside the tr, we need 4 td elements. So td times 4, tab. Okay. Now, in the first column, we're going to render expense.description. In the second one, we're going to render expense.amount. In the third one, we're going to render expense.category. And in the last column, we're going to render a button. So a button with two classes, btn and btn-outline-danger. An outline button doesn't have a background color. It only has a border, okay? So tab, we call this delete. Now, because the list of expenses is passed here via props, it's maintained somewhere else inside the parent component. So as I told you before, the component that holds some state should be the one updating it. So when the user clicks the delete button, we don't want to delete an expense here. Instead, we should notify the parent or the consumer of this component that an expense should be deleted. And to do that, we need a callback function. So we go back to our props and add a new property here, onDelete. This is going to be a function that takes the ID of the expense as a number and returns void. Now let's add that to the props here, onDelete. And with this, we can handle the click event of the button. And here we pass an arrow function. In this arrow function, we call onDelete and pass the ID of the current expense we are rendering. So expense.id. Let me save the changes. Okay, look, this is what I've done. So in onClick, we pass an arrow function. In this arrow function, we call onDelete, which is a callback function. And here we pass the ID of the expense we are rendering, okay? So we're done with the body section. Now, after that, we need to add the footer. So here we need a tfoot element. Inside the tfoot, we need a tr. And inside the tr, we need 4 td elements, okay? So here we add total. In the next column, we need to calculate the total dynamically. And to do that, we're going to use the reduce method of arrays. So here we add braces. Now in JavaScript, all arrays have a reduce method that we can use to combine all elements in the array into something else. For example, here we can combine all expense objects into a number that represents the total. The way we do this is by passing an arrow function with 2 parameters here. So the first parameter is ACC, that is short for accumulator. This is like a variable that holds the total amount. The second parameter is an expense object. So this arrow function has 2 parameters. Now in the body of this arrow function, we need to get the amount of the current expense and add it to the accumulator. So the accumulator is just a number that holds the total value, okay? So the reduce method iterates over our array of expenses, and in each iteration, it runs this arrow function. It takes the amount of the current expense and adds it to the accumulator, okay? Now, as the second argument to the reduce method, we need to pass the initial value for the accumulator. We're going to set that to 0, okay? So this returns a number. So after we call the reduce method, we call the toFixed method. This is available on all numbers in JavaScript. And here we pass 2 to specify the number of digits after the decimal point. Now, before that, I want to add a $sign so we can see the total amount in dollars. We're almost there. Now we need to test this. So let's add this to our app component, expense list. Now here we need to pass 2 props, expenses. And for that, we need to create an array of expense objects. So I'm going to create some dummy data real quick, just for the purpose of testing this component. So here in the app component, we create an array of expenses. Each expense is going to have a few properties: ID, description, and amount, as well as category. Let's say utilities. Now let's just duplicate this a few times and change the IDs as well as descriptions. The rest doesn't really matter. So we pass that array right here, expenses. We also need to set onDelete to a function. For now, we don't want to worry about deleting an expense. Let's just do a console.log and see if everything works up to this point. So delete. You know what? In fact, it's better to add the ID here so we can display it on the console. Okay, back to the browser. Here's what we get. The total is calculated properly. Beautiful. Now let's implement the delete functionality. So here we're going to use the state hook to store the list of expenses. So we call use state. And as an argument, we pass this array that we just created, like this. Now this returns a state variable. We call that expenses, and the updater function is going to be called set expenses. Okay. With that, the last step is to remove the given expense from this array. So here we call set expenses to expenses.filter. We want to return all expenses except the one with the given ID. So e goes to e.id should not be equal to ID. Let me save the changes. Okay, here's what we have done. We have set onDelete to an arrow function that takes an ID. Here we call set expenses and get all expenses except the one with the given ID. Now let's test this functionality. Okay, and look, as we are deleting items, the total is recalculated. So now the total is 0. Now, one last thing I want to do here is that if there are no expenses, I don't want to render this table. So back to our component. Here we can say if expenses.length is 0, return null. With that, if we delete all these expenses, the table disappears. Beautiful. So the first step is done. Next, we're going to implement filtering.